The bathroom door would not open. Mickey Deans pressed against it once, then again, feeling resistance from the other side. It was mid-morning in Chelsea, June 22nd, 1969. The small mews house at 4 Cadogan Lane sat quiet beneath a pale London sky. Inside, the silence had already begun to settle into something permanent. When Deans finally managed to force entry, he found his wife seated on the toilet, her head slumped forward, her hands resting in her lap. Judy Garland was 47 years old. She had been dead for several hours. The coroner would later determine that she had locked the door sometime during the night, likely out of habit. There was no note, no evidence of deliberate intent. Her death was ruled an accidental overdose of barbiturates, specifically Seconal, the same medication she had relied upon for decades to find sleep, to quiet her mind, to escape the persistent noise of a body that had never quite belonged to her. The official finding carried the weight of medical certainty, an incautious self-overdosage, a gradual accumulation of the drug in her bloodstream, compounded by years of tolerance and dependence. There was no suggestion of suicide, though the question lingered in the days that followed, spoken in half-whispers by those who had known her and those who had only watched from a distance. What the coroner's report did not address, what it could not address, was the trajectory that had led to this rented house in a foreign city, thousands of miles from the studios and estates that had once defined her public existence. Judy Garland had lived in some of the most celebrated addresses in Los Angeles. She had owned homes in Brentwood and Beverly Hills, residences with manicured grounds and gated entries, the kinds of properties that appeared in magazine spreads and signaled arrival. And yet she had died in a borrowed space, a temporary arrangement in a country where she had come seeking work, seeking renewal, seeking something that had eluded her for years. The pattern was visible to anyone who cared to look. A cycle of acquisition and loss, of moving in and moving on, of houses that promised stability but delivered only transition. By 1969, Judy Garland had no permanent residence in the United States. The Brentwood estate where she had once raised her children had passed into other hands. The Beverly Hills properties were gone. What remained was a trail of addresses scattered across 2 continents, each one marking a chapter in a life that refused to settle. Mickey Deans had married her just 3 months earlier, in March. They had met in New York, where she was performing at a nightclub, and their courtship had been brief, impulsive, charged with the particular urgency that seemed to follow her everywhere. He was her 5th husband. He was 34 years old. He would later describe finding her body as the moment his world collapsed, though others who knew them suggested the marriage had already shown signs of strain. In the hours after her death was confirmed, telephone lines between London and Los Angeles carried the news across the Atlantic. Studio executives who had not spoken to her in years released carefully worded statements. Former colleagues expressed shock, though few could claim surprise. The tabloids, which had chronicled her every stumble for decades, began assembling their retrospectives, their tone shifting from mockery to mourning with practiced ease. What emerged in those first reports was a familiar narrative. The child star who had burned too bright, the voice that had soared while the woman behind it struggled to stay aloft. It was a story that had been written many times before, revised and updated with each new crisis, each new marriage, each new comeback that promised redemption. Now it had reached its final chapter, and the ending seemed almost inevitable. A conclusion that had been foreshadowed so often, it had lost the capacity to shock. But inevitability is a construction imposed after the fact. It obscures the choices that were made, the systems that were built. The hands that shaped a life before it had the chance to shape itself. Judy Garland did not arrive at that bathroom door in Chelsea through fate alone. She arrived there through a series of decisions, some her own, many not, that began decades earlier, in a world where studios controlled not only careers, but bodies, where pills were dispensed like currency, and where a child could be transformed into a commodity before she understood what was being taken from her. The houses she left behind in Los Angeles still stand. Some have been renovated, others preserved, a few demolished to make way for newer constructions. They hold no plaques, no markers indicating who once lived within their walls. The woman who occupied them has become a legend, her image frozen in Technicolor, her voice preserved on acetate and oxide. But the spaces she moved through have been emptied of her presence, absorbed back into the anonymous geography of wealth and reinvention that defines the city she once called home. She was born Frances Ethel Gumm on June 10, 1922, in Grand Rapids, Minnesota, a town of modest ambitions and Lutheran restraint. Her parents, Frank and Ethel Gumm, operated a movie theater called the New Grand, where vaudeville acts still shared billing with silent pictures, and the boundary between performance and daily life had not yet hardened into separation. By the time Frances was 2 years old, she had already appeared on stage, pushed forward by a mother whose own theatrical aspirations had curdled into something more insistent, more vicarious. The child could sing. That much was evident from the beginning. What remained to be determined was who would control the voice. The Gumm family relocated to Lancaster, California, in 1926, seeking the proximity to Los Angeles that so many families sought in those years, the gravitational pull of an industry that promised transformation. Frank Gumm purchased another theater, the Valley Theater, and the family settled into a house on Cedar Street, a structure of no particular distinction that would later be preserved as a monument to origins. But origins, in the mythology of Hollywood, are meant to be transcended. The point was never to remain in Lancaster. The point was to escape. Ethel Gumm understood this with a clarity that bordered on compulsion. She drove her 3 daughters through an endless circuit of talent shows, theater bookings, and studio auditions, treating each performance as an investment in a future that had not yet materialized. The Gumm sisters, as they were initially billed, played wherever they could find an audience: fairs, conventions, small-time vaudeville houses that smelled of dust and disappointment. Frances was the youngest, the smallest, the one whose voice seemed disproportionate to her frame. Audiences noticed. Ethel noticed. The machinery of ambition began to turn. The name change came in 1935, though accounts differ on the precise circumstances. Frances Gumm became Judy Garland, a construction assembled from a popular song, and the surname of a theater critic, depending on which version of the story one believes. What matters is not the etymology, but the transformation it signaled. A new name meant a new identity, one that could be shaped and marketed, one that belonged less to the girl who carried it than to the industry that would soon claim ownership. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer signed her in September of that year. She was 13 years old. The contract bound her to the studio for 7 years, with options that allowed MGM to extend or terminate the arrangement at their discretion. In exchange, she received a weekly salary, access to the studio's resources, and entry into a system designed to manufacture stars with industrial efficiency. What she surrendered in return was less easily quantified: autonomy, privacy, the ordinary rhythms of adolescence, the right to decide what entered her own body. The pills began almost immediately. Studio executives regarded Judy Garland as a problem to be solved. She was not conventionally beautiful by the narrow standards of the era. Her nose was deemed too prominent, her figure too round, her teeth imperfect. Where other contract players could be photographed from flattering angles and left to their natural devices, Judy required intervention. She was fitted with rubber discs, to reshape her nose for certain shots. Her breasts were bound to maintain a girlish silhouette. And she was given pills. Pills to suppress her appetite. Pills to keep her energetic during long shooting days. Pills to help her sleep when the stimulants left her wired and restless. The tablets came in different colors, administered by studio physicians, with the casual authority of men who understood their role in the production process. Benzedrine to wake her up, phenobarbital to bring her down. The cycle established itself before she was old enough to understand its implications, before she had developed the language to question what was being done to her. She was a minor, a contract player, a commodity in which the studio had invested significant resources. Her compliance was assumed. Her body was company property. Ethel Gum, who might have intervened, did not. By most accounts, she participated in the regimen, ensuring that her daughter followed the prescribed schedule, treating the pills as simply another aspect of professional discipline. The relationship between mother and daughter had already begun to sour, poisoned by years of pressure and proximity, by the particular resentments that accumulate when one person's dreams are forcibly transferred onto another. Judy would later describe her mother as the real-life Wicked Witch of the West, a characterization that carried the weight of accumulated grievance. But in 1935, there was no escape from her influence. The contract had been signed. The transformation was underway. What emerged from those early years at MGM was a performer of remarkable gifts and fragile constitution. Judy Garland could inhabit a song with emotional precision that belied her age. She could convey longing, joy, heartbreak, and hope within the span of a single verse, her voice carrying frequencies that seemed to bypass the intellect and speak directly to something deeper. The camera recognized this quality even when executives remained uncertain. She was not a beauty in the mold of Lana Turner or Hedy Lamarr, but she possessed something more difficult to manufacture: authenticity, or at least its convincing simulation. Her first significant film roles came in 1936 and 1937, a series of musical shorts and features that tested her appeal with audiences. The studio paired her with Mickey Rooney, another young contract player whose energy matched her own, and the combination proved commercially viable. They made 9 films together over the following years, each one reinforcing the image of wholesome American youth that MGM wished to project. Behind the scenes, the pills continued. The weight fluctuated, the pressure mounted. But on screen, Judy Garland smiled and sang and appeared to embody everything the nation wanted to believe about itself. The role that would define her arrived in 1938, though she was not the first choice to play it. Shirley Temple, the reigning child star of the era, had been the studio's preference for Dorothy Gale, the Kansas farm girl swept by tornado into a Technicolor fantasy. But Temple was under contract to 20th Century Fox, and negotiations collapsed. And so the part fell to Judy Garland, almost by default, a second choice who would become synonymous with the character in ways that erased all memory of alternatives. Filming on The Wizard of Oz began in October 1938 and continued for nearly 6 months, a grueling production that demanded more from its young star than any previous assignment. Judy was 16 years old, playing a character meant to be several years younger, and the strain of maintaining that illusion manifested in ways both visible and hidden. Her costume included a corset designed to flatten her maturing figure. Her diet was restricted to soup and cigarettes, supplemented by the usual regimen of amphetamines. She worked 6 days a week, often 12 hours or more, her energy sustained by chemistry rather than rest. The set itself was a hazardous environment. The Technicolor process required intense lighting that raised temperatures to uncomfortable levels. The Tin Man's original makeup poisoned the actor who first wore it. The Wicked Witch suffered burns during a pyrotechnic sequence, And Judy, at the center of it all, endured take after take of musical numbers that would later seem effortless, their difficulty invisible to audiences who saw only the finished product. Over the Rainbow almost did not survive the editing process. Studio executives considered cutting the song, deeming it too slow, too melancholic, a deviation from the brighter tone they preferred. They were overruled, and the ballad remained, and it became the defining anthem of Judy Garland's career, a song about longing for escape, for a place where troubles melt like lemon drops, for a home that exists only in imagination. She would sing it thousands of times over the following 3 decades, each performance carrying the accumulated weight of everything that had happened since she first recorded it in a studio soundstage at 17. The film premiered in August 1939 and achieved immediate cultural penetration. Judy Garland became a star of the first magnitude, her face recognized across the country, her voice emanating from radios and jukeboxes and theater speakers. MGM rewarded her with a special Academy Award, a miniature Oscar presented at the ceremony the following year, acknowledging her status as the best juvenile performer of 1939. She stood on stage in a gown selected by Studio Wardrobe, smiled for the cameras, and accepted the trophy as validation of everything that had been invested in her development. What the award did not acknowledge was the cost of that development, the toll already visible to those who worked closely with her. By 1940, Judy Garland was 18 years old and thoroughly dependent on the pharmaceutical regimen that governed her days. She had never known adult life without stimulants and sedatives. She had never learned to regulate her own energy, her own appetite, her own sleep. The studio had assumed those functions, outsourcing them to doctors and pills, and she had internalized the arrangement as normal. It was simply how one worked in pictures. It was simply what was required. Her first marriage came in 1941 to bandleader David Rose, a union that lasted less than 2 years and produced no children. The studio had initially opposed the relationship, preferring to maintain Judy's image as an available ingenue, but eventually relented when it became clear she would proceed regardless. What ended the marriage remains subject to interpretation. Some accounts suggest incompatibility, the ordinary friction of 2 careers colliding. Others point to an abortion, possibly coerced by the studio, which left emotional damage that never fully healed. Judy herself spoke of it rarely, and when she did, her accounts varied with the years. The homes began to multiply in this period. With her rising salary came the capacity to acquire property, to establish residences that signified arrival and success. She purchased her first house in the early 1940s, a property in the Bel Air area that offered privacy and space, the amenities expected of a major studio star. But ownership proved less permanent than it appeared. The houses came and went, sold or lost or abandoned, as circumstances shifted, each one representing a chapter rather than a foundation. Her second marriage, to director Vincente Minnelli in 1945, seemed to offer greater stability. Minnelli was a respected figure at MGM, a man of artistic sensibility who understood the pressures of studio life. Together they made several films, most notably Meet Me in St. Louis, which showcased Judy's talents within a nostalgic framework that audiences embraced. Their daughter Lisa was born in March 1946, and for a time the family presented an image of domestic contentment that aligned with post-war expectations. They settled in a house on Evanview Drive in the Hollywood Hills, a residence that reflected their combined status within the industry. The property had grounds suitable for a child, rooms sufficient for entertaining, the architectural details that marked it as a home of consequence. Photographs from this period show Judy in domestic settings, holding her daughter, smiling beside her husband, performing the role of wife and mother with the same professionalism, she brought to her screen work. But the pills continued. The anxiety persisted. The marriage, which had seemed so promising, began to fracture under pressures, both internal and external. Minnelli was absorbed in his work, often absent during long productions. Judy's own health deteriorated, her weight fluctuating dramatically, her mood swinging between euphoria and despair. By 1950, the studio that had created her had begun to view her as a liability rather than an asset. The machinery of transformation was preparing to expel what it could no longer use. The suspension came in June 1950. MGM, the studio that had signed her as a child, that had administered her pills and controlled her image and profited from her voice for 15 years, informed Judy Garland that her services were no longer required. The official explanation cited her inability to meet production schedules, her chronic lateness, her physical and emotional unreliability. The unofficial truth was more complex. A mutual exhaustion, a system that had used her until she showed signs of breaking, then discarded her before the breakage became too visible. She was 28 years old and had never known professional life outside the studio system. The structure that had confined her had also supported her, providing roles and income, and a framework within which her talents could be deployed. Without it, she faced a void that no amount of fame could fill. The houses, the contracts, the marriages, all of it had been built upon a foundation that was now crumbling beneath her feet. The first suicide attempt came shortly after the suspension, though the details remain contested. Some accounts describe her slashing her throat with a broken glass in the bathroom of her home. Others suggest the wound was superficial, a gesture rather than a genuine effort at self-destruction. What is certain is that she was hospitalized, that the incident became public knowledge, and that the narrative of Judy Garland's decline had now acquired a new and darker dimension. The girl who had sung about rainbows was now a woman who had tried to end her own life. The Minnelli marriage dissolved in 1951, another casualty of the pressures that had been building for years. Vincente retained his position at MGM, his career continuing along its established trajectory. Judy was left to navigate an industry that no longer knew what to do with her. Her reputation shadowed by stories of instability, her bankability uncertain. The house on Evenview Drive passed out of her possession, another address added to the growing list of former residences. What saved her temporarily was the stage. In 1951, she embarked on a concert tour of Europe, performing in London and other cities, to audiences who remembered her from her films and were eager to experience her voice in person. The response was overwhelming. Freed from the constraints of studio production, from the cameras that captured every flaw, Judy Garland discovered a new mode of performance, raw, immediate, emotionally exposed, in ways that film had never permitted. She stood alone on stage and sang, and audiences responded with an intensity that bordered on worship. The London Palladium concerts became legendary, establishing a template she would follow for the remainder of her career. The intimacy of live performance suited her in ways that the manufactured perfection of Hollywood never had. She could be imperfect, could stumble and recover, could transform her vulnerabilities into connection rather than liability. The pills still governed her rhythms, the anxiety still haunted her, but on stage she found something that resembled control, or at least its convincing illusion. Her third husband entered her life during this period of reinvention. Sidney Luft was a producer of modest credentials and considerable ambition, a man who saw in Judy Garland both a romantic partner and a professional opportunity. They married in 1952, and he assumed management of her career, guiding her toward a film project that would mark her return to Hollywood prominence. A Star is Born, released in 1954, was designed as a comeback vehicle, a showcase for talents that the industry had nearly discarded. The production was troubled from the start. Judy's health remained precarious, her attendance unpredictable, her emotional state volatile. Costs escalated as shooting extended far beyond schedule. Warner Brothers, which had financed the film, grew increasingly alarmed at the mounting expenses. But when A Star Is Born finally reached theaters, it vindicated those who had believed in her. The performance was extraordinary, layered, devastating, a portrait of artistic ambition and personal destruction that drew openly from her own experience. She was nominated for the Academy Award, the favorite to win, her rehabilitation seemingly complete. On the night of the ceremony, television cameras were positioned in her hospital room, where she had just given birth to her son Joseph. The assumption was that she would be announced as Best Actress, that the cameras would capture her triumph from her bed, that the narrative of comeback would reach its triumphant conclusion. The award went to Grace Kelly instead. The loss became another chapter in the mythology, evidence of an industry that had failed her, that refused to acknowledge what she had overcome. Groucho Marx reportedly called it the biggest robbery since Brinks. Whether the sentiment was justified or merely partisan, the impact on Judy was observable. Something shifted after that night, a resignation settling into place alongside the determination that had carried her this far. The Lufts established a home in Holmby Hills during these years, a substantial property befitting a star of her renewed stature. 2 children had now arrived, Lorna in 1952, Joseph in 1955, and the household expanded to accommodate them. Servants were employed, grounds maintained, the apparatus of domestic wealth assembled and operated. From the outside, it appeared that Judy Garland had achieved the stability that had eluded her for so long. But finances, always precarious, began their slow deterioration. The concert tours generated income, but expenses consumed it as quickly as it arrived. Management fees, legal costs, the overhead of maintaining a lifestyle commensurate with fame, all of it drained resources faster than they could be replenished. The Internal Revenue Service began to take notice, assembling claims that would shadow her for years. The house in Holmby Hills, like so many before it, would eventually slip from her grasp. The pattern of acquisition and loss accelerated through the late 1950s, each property marking a moment of hope, followed by inevitable relinquishment. The Holmby Hills estate gave way to other addresses, rentals, temporary arrangements, houses borrowed from friends during periods of financial distress. Judy Garland moved through Los Angeles like a ghost haunting her own former lives, each relocation a reminder of what had been surrendered. The marriage to Sidney Luft deteriorated along predictable lines. He had managed her career with varying degrees of competence, negotiating contracts and organizing tours, while their personal relationship frayed under the weight of her dependencies and his own limitations. They separated and reconciled multiple times, the cycle repeating with diminishing conviction. The children, Liza from her marriage to Minnelli, Lorna and Joseph with Luft, witnessed the turbulence from close range. Their childhoods shaped by instability they were too young to comprehend. Concert tours remained her primary source of income, but the demands they placed on her body and mind grew increasingly unsustainable. She would arrive at venues hours late, sometimes not at all, her reputation for unreliability preceding her to each new engagement. Promoters learned to build contingencies into their contracts, to prepare audiences for delays, to hope that when she finally took the stage, the performance would justify the chaos that surrounded it. Often it did. Her voice, though showing signs of wear, retained its capacity to devastate. Audiences forgave her everything when she sang. The Carnegie Hall concert of April 1961 became the apotheosis of this late period. She performed for nearly 3 hours to an audience that included celebrities, critics, and devoted fans who had followed her career through all its convulsions. The recording of that evening sold in extraordinary numbers, winning multiple Grammy Awards and achieving a cultural significance that transcended mere commercial success. It captured something essential about Judy Garland at 40, the vulnerability, the determination, the sense that each performance might be her last, and therefore demanded everything she had to give. But concert fees, however substantial, could not keep pace with the debts that had accumulated. The IRS pursued her relentlessly, filing liens against her earnings, claiming back taxes that compounded with penalties and interest. Lawyers and accountants cycled through her employ, each one attempting to impose order on finances that had long since escaped rational management. The houses she had owned were gone. The houses she rented were subject to the whims of landlords and the limits of her credit. In 1962, she acquired a property in Brentwood that seemed to offer once again the possibility of permanence. The house on Rockingham Avenue was substantial without being ostentatious, situated in a neighborhood that balanced privacy with proximity to the industry that still defined her identity. She moved in with her children, attempting to establish the domestic stability that had eluded them for years. For a time, it appeared that this house might be different, might become the home that previous addresses had only pretended to be. The television series that CBS offered her in 1963 represented another attempt at reinvention. The Judy Garland Show was conceived as a weekly variety program, a showcase for her talents that would bring her into American living rooms on a regular basis. The format seemed ideally suited to her gifts: musical performances, celebrity guests, the intimate connection with audiences that she had mastered on the concert stage. Network executives anticipated strong ratings and a long run. The reality proved more complicated. Behind the scenes, the production was marked by creative conflicts, personnel changes, and the familiar struggles with Judy's health and reliability. She clashed with producers over the show's direction, fought to maintain artistic control, arrived at tapings in states that ranged from brilliant to barely functional. The ratings never reached the levels CBS had projected, and the network's support eroded as the season progressed. The show was cancelled after 26 episodes, another promising venture that had failed to achieve its potential. The Brentwood house did not survive the television show's failure. Financial pressures intensified, and the property that had seemed like a foundation revealed itself as merely another temporary arrangement. By 1966, Judy Garland no longer owned a home in Los Angeles, the city where she had arrived as a child, where she had been transformed into a star, where she had raised her children and buried her marriages. That city no longer contained a space she could call her own. Her fourth husband, Mark Herron, entered and exited her life with the brevity that had come to characterize her relationships. They married in 1965, separated within months, and divorced in 1967, the union producing nothing but additional legal complications and tabloid fodder. Herron was an actor of limited accomplishment, a man whose primary distinction became his brief tenure as Judy Garland's husband. What drew them together and what drove them apart followed patterns too familiar to require detailed examination. The children by now had begun to establish their own trajectories. Liza, the eldest, had inherited her mother's talent and was building a career that would eventually rival and perhaps surpass Judy's own. She had witnessed more than any child should witness, had learned early that love and chaos were not mutually exclusive, had developed the resilience that comes from surviving what cannot be controlled. Lorna and Joseph, younger and therefore exposed for a shorter duration, nonetheless carried their own wounds, their own adaptations to a childhood defined by uncertainty. Judy's relationship with her children remained complicated by her dependencies and her absences, by the demands of a career that left little room for conventional motherhood. She loved them, of this there seems little doubt, but love, in her experience, had never been sufficient to prevent loss. The houses they had shared were gone. The stability she had wanted to provide had never materialized. What she could offer them was her presence when she was capable of it, her voice when she chose to share it, and the complicated inheritance of a name that would follow them wherever they went. The geography of her final years became increasingly international, as if distance from Los Angeles might provide the escape that no house within its boundaries had ever offered. She performed in London, in Copenhagen, in Melbourne, carrying her voice across oceans to audiences who received her with an adulation that American venues could no longer reliably provide. The mythology of Judy Garland had taken on dimensions that transcended her actual performances. She had become a symbol, an icon of survival and suffering, a figure onto whom audiences projected their own struggles and hopes for redemption. The gay community in particular had claimed her as their own. The reasons for this identification were never fully articulated, perhaps because they resisted simple explanation. Something in her vulnerability, her persistence in the face of rejection, her refusal to disappear despite every inducement to do so. Something in this resonated with men who understood what it meant to live outside the boundaries of acceptance. Her concerts became gatherings, communal experiences that affirmed shared identity. When she sang about somewhere over the rainbow, the longing she expressed became their longing too. But identification, however genuine, could not pay her debts or stabilize her health. By 1967, Judy Garland was performing in venues that would have seemed beneath her a decade earlier. Small clubs, hotel lounges, any engagement that promised payment sufficient to meet immediate needs. The voice that had once filled the Hollywood Bowl now competed with the clatter of dinner service and the murmur of distracted patrons. She adapted as she had always adapted, scaling her performance to the space available, finding intimacy where grandeur was no longer possible. The physical toll of decades of chemical dependency had become impossible to conceal. Her weight fluctuated dramatically, her face showing the strain of years spent at war with her own body. Photographs from this period reveal a woman who appeared far older than her mid-40s, the elfin quality of her youth replaced by a gauntness that suggested consumption from within. Yet when she sang, something of the original magic persisted. The voice, though diminished in power, retained its emotional precision, its capacity to locate and articulate feelings that listeners might not have known they possessed. She moved through a series of temporary residences during these years, hotel rooms, borrowed apartments, the homes of friends who offered shelter during periods of particular crisis. The concept of home had become almost abstract, a word that referred to no specific place, but rather to a condition she had never quite achieved. Her possessions, such as they remained, were scattered across storage facilities and the houses of former associates. The accumulation of a lifetime had been dispersed, sold off, or simply lost in the chaos of perpetual relocation. In late 1968, she arrived in London for what would become an extended stay. The city had always received her warmly, its audiences less jaded than their American counterparts, its tabloid press somehow less vicious, despite its reputation for cruelty. She performed a 5-week run at the Talk of the Town, a nightclub engagement that tested the limits of her endurance, but confirmed that she could still command attention when circumstances aligned. The reviews were mixed. Some nights she was transcendent, others she struggled to complete her set. But the engagement represented work, income, a reason to continue. Mickey Deans appeared in her life during this period, a nightclub manager from New York, who had encountered her during an earlier engagement and maintained contact through the intervening months. He was younger than she was, less accomplished, possessed of an optimism about her prospects that seemed either touching or delusional, depending on one's perspective. They began a relationship that moved quickly toward marriage, as her relationships always did, the velocity perhaps reflecting an urgency that she felt but could not name. They married in London on March 15, 1969, at the Chelsea Register office. She wore a blue chiffon dress and carried flowers. The guest list was small, the ceremony brief, the celebration modest by the standards of her previous weddings. Photographs show her smiling beside her new husband, her expression suggesting hope or its performance, the distinction between the two having long since become irrelevant. The house in Chelsea, the Muse property at 4 Cadogan Lane, became their home, a rental arranged through connections Deans had cultivated during his time in London. It was a small space by the standards she had once maintained, a cottage rather than an estate, its rooms compact and its appointments modest. But it was a place to sleep, a place to plan, a base from which the next chapter might be launched. Deans spoke of projects in development, of concert tours being organized, of a future that would vindicate their union and restore her to the prominence she deserved. What that future might have contained remains a matter of speculation. The weeks following their marriage were marked by the familiar patterns, periods of relative stability alternating with episodes of crisis, plans made and abandoned, the rhythm of dependency continuing beneath the surface of domestic arrangement. She was tired in ways that sleep could not address, her body bearing the accumulated damage of decades spent in chemical warfare against itself. The pills that had once provided energy now merely postponed collapse. The sleep they induced was not rest, but temporary absence. Her final public performance took place in Copenhagen in late March, a concert that those present would later describe with the reverence reserved for relics. She was not in good voice that evening, her instrument showing the wear that could no longer be concealed, but she performed with the commitment that had always characterized her work. The audience responded with the devotion she had come to expect from European crowds, their applause acknowledging not just the performance, but the performer, the history she carried, the survival she represented. The weeks between Copenhagen and Chelsea passed in a blur of diminishing options. Deans continued to speak of plans, of engagements that might materialize, of a documentary project that would tell her story in her own words. She participated in these discussions with varying degrees of engagement, her energy fluctuating according to rhythms that had long since escaped her control. The small house on Cadogan Lane contained them both, its walls absorbing conversations that oscillated between hope and resignation. On the evening of June 21, 1969, they attended a small gathering, returning home late. The details of what followed exist only in Dean's account, offered to investigators and later to journalists seeking to reconstruct her final hours. They talked for a time. She seemed in reasonable spirits, neither better nor worse than usual. At some point during the night, she rose and went to the bathroom, locking the door behind her. She did not emerge. The official finding, accidental overdose, an incautious accumulation of barbiturates in the bloodstream, provided closure of a legal nature without explaining anything that mattered. The body was returned to the United States, to New York, where Frank Campbell's funeral home prepared her for viewing. 20,000 people filed past her coffin, a final audience paying respects to a performer who had given them something they could not easily name. James Mason, who had played opposite her in A Star is Born, delivered the eulogy, his words careful and measured, acknowledging loss without attempting to explain it. She was buried at Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, New York, far from the California landscape that had shaped her career. The grave received visitors for decades, fans who left flowers and tokens, who stood in silence before a marker that reduced a life to names and dates. In 2017, her remains were moved to Hollywood Forever Cemetery in Los Angeles, returned at last to the city she had fled, interred among the industry figures who had been her colleagues and competitors and witnesses. The houses she left behind retained no memory of her presence. The Brentwood property on Rockingham Avenue passed through subsequent owners, its rooms renovated, its grounds reconfigured, no trace remaining of the family that had briefly occupied it. The other addresses, Evanview Drive, Holmby Hills, the various rentals and temporary arrangements, similarly absorbed her absence, continuing as real estate, while the life that had animated them receded into history. What persists is the voice, preserved on recordings that continue to circulate, to find new listeners, to transmit across the decades something that resists description. The songs she sang carry meanings that exceed their lyrics, frequencies that speak to experiences she understood without ever fully escaping. Somewhere Over the Rainbow remains an anthem of longing, its promise of a place where troubles melt away, rendered more poignant by the knowledge of who sang it and what she endured. Her children survived her and built lives of their own, carrying forward a name that opened doors while casting shadows. Liza achieved the stardom that seemed almost genetically ordained, her talent and her struggles, echoing her mother's in ways that critics noted and she herself acknowledged. Lorna and Joseph found paths less public, but no less shaped by what they had witnessed, the inheritance of chaos manifesting in forms particular to each. The industry that created Judy Garland has never fully reckoned with what it did to her. The studio system that administered pills to children, that treated bodies as company property, that discarded performers when they showed signs of the damage it had inflicted.